I'd like to thank our top sponsors, Alistair Blaine, Anders Berge Christensen, and Eric Lasky for making this show possible. And welcome to the 28th episode of The Cave of Apelles. Classical architecture appeals to us because it emulates the forms and proportions of nature. Human beings need timeless surroundings that reflect us, regardless of whether they are traditional or not. Modern architecture is not daring, it is quite simply not resonating. Joining me tonight is a young classical architect to elaborate on this and to share success stories from all over the world. Kristian Hoff-Andersen, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you very much.
So, we normally do a bio in the beginning. You wanted to start with who you are, how you started your education and your experiences, not least as someone who wants to learn classical architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I am born in 1986 in Drammen, Norway, and I grew up, as everyone does there, very near to the forest. It's a long city with a river in the middle and forested hills on each side. And I learned to grew to love nature from a very young age. And my first foray into, let's say, public engagement was through environmental activism. Mm-hmm. For me, conservative values have always been about conserving, let's say, aspects of nature and of culture that are valuable, like old buildings, for example, or a particular forest that I loved from a very young age.
Yeah, how did you get into liking classical architecture?
Well, for me it was very obvious. I loved old buildings, and I read this book at one point that talked about how cities could be good places to live, and how dwellings, houses, can make up very good cities, which is very new to me because I grew up in, like most people do in Norway, in a single-family house. And it sparked something in me. I was 15 years old and I found it in the school library. And since then, I thought, this is something that I can do. This is somewhere where I can contribute. And from the very beginning, I understood that it was possible to build on old buildings, on classical architecture, and the values of let's say, the humanistic values of classical architecture.
That's interesting.
And then I also understood that a lot of people don't think that's possible. And so I was very conscious from the beginning that it was somewhat controversial. But then again, I never minded that. So
right. And that's so, I don't know, fascinating, or what word I should use. Because I think there's a lot of experiences that you've had wanting to learn classical architecture that are more or less completely identical to a person who wants to learn classical figurative painting or to compose in a tonal manner. Mm. So, how was that experience when you decided to start studying classical architecture, or wanted to study classical architecture?
Well, I applied at a number of different schools. I got into a number of schools. There's a single school in the whole world that really focuses on these things, and that is Notre Dame University in Indiana in the United States, where I didn't get in. So I got into a very good school, a Bergen School of Architecture, where they're very much focused on the vernacular architecture, the traditional architecture with architects in Western Norway, and we learned about the Western Norwegian landscape. But I understood from very early on that you were supposed to take this traditional architecture and somehow abstract it and turn it into something a bit different, something a bit more modern, I guess.
But what was the argument they would present, or why should you do that?
I'm not.
Was there a clear argument for it, or just that you should do it?
No. Well, I think the argument is like the overreaching argument that you keep hearing again and again, which is that it's not of our time if you do it too traditionally. That's the only argument that there is.
Okay.
And of course, I don't find it to be a particularly good one. And I did try to also pursue classical architecture, like high classical. But I found that it was complicated to find ways to do it within the education. And then fast forwarding a bit, I did my master's in Copenhagen, and I had done the summer before doing my diploma, my master's degree, which we, in architecture, of course, we draw our master's degrees. We don't usually write them. So I'd been to a summer school, classical architecture in Sweden, the Engelsberg Summer School, and I knew I wanted to do something classical for my diploma, but I needed to find a way to do it, because I'd heard stories about people who'd failed semesters, and I'd also tried doing classical stuff earlier and gotten very harsh feedback on that from different places. A lot of censors seem to be a bit confused by the whole thing. Like, they were like, "Why are you doing this? I don't get it. Like, other people have done this before you."
So just to pause a little bit right there.
Yeah.
Was it it's a bit sort of an ideological aggression, but also just not a complete lack of understanding why anyone would want to do something that is not in our time, so-called in our time?
I think it's a mixture. I think some people believe it's somehow morally wrong. Or that it represents, let's say, right-wing political values, which is kind of absurd for me, because I grew up in environmentalism and as a queer activist and engaged in social democratic politics.
Yeah.
So I always found it very strange to be accused of that, with my more or less eco-socialist views. But
so funny.
Yeah, it is quite funny, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why it never got to me. I never took it personally, because I didn't feel like that sort of feedback really hit.
So the implications that they were in their sort of quote unquote arguments never hit you, basically.
No, and I think when you're talking about ideology. For most people, it's not ideology. It's more a sense of this is not something we do anymore, and it's more or less something you've just been taught by habit in school.
Yeah, by osmosis.
Yes, but there are arguments. I remember a conversation we had in the school in Copenhagen where our teacher said, "We can't build the way we used to because we don't live in a world the way people used to before. We're just living in some chaotic thing. We don't know what is anymore. The universe is not a place that makes sense anymore the way it used to. So we don't live in a world, and we can't make architecture the way people used to anymore." And then there's the other arguments, of course. There's the argument we don't have artisans who know this, how to do this, which is wrong, of course. I follow so many wonderful artisans on Instagram, everything from masons to decorative painters to traditional carpentry. So many talented people that still know how to do all these things. There's the argument of sort of like a fate argument, that because technology has progressed, so architecture also has to progress, and shouldn't look like something that's been done before, which is very strange, because architecture is always built on the things that came before, and something that is built is per definition of its time, isn't it? You can't build something that's not of its time. That's completely absurd. If you build it, and especially if a lot of people do it, then it's definitely a part of what's happening in contemporary times, at least. So there were these arguments, but they didn't stick. So I knew I wanted to do something, and I'd heard stories about people who'd failed courses. Now I don't
because of having done
classical architecture, because it was seen as sort of like sign you haven't understood what's going on. If you're doing classical architecture, you've misunderstood something. It's a sign that you're not with it. So anyway, I had to find an opening, and I considered several different approaches. I considered doing like a fictional project, let's say set in an alternative timeline or something like that, or in the future. I considered doing something purely theoretical, but then I found the ultimate way of approaching this, because there's a tradition in architecture schools that the diploma project should be something personal. Very often you take yourself as a starting point, and for most people that often means you make a project for your hometown. So I did have ideas for doing things for Drammen, but then we all went to Tbilisi, my whole program, the 30 of us plus teachers and everything, Tbilisi, Georgia. And So I left that, and then I got the idea of doing queer architecture, which had never been done in the Danish Academy as far as I know before. And it's sort of a trend these days. And again, as a former queer activist, I think that's wonderful. I really don't mind. But I also knew that this is strategically...
You had to use that. And what year was this?
What?
Which year was this?
So that was the end of fifth year, or most of fifth year of architecture school. Oh, no, you mean like Anno Domini?
Yeah.
So this was 2017, 2016 to 2017. And because I'm a gay man, I can sort of do that with a degree of authenticity. Authenticity,
so you get
word.
That shield that you can hide behind.
Exactly. I have more of a right to do it than anyone else.
And this is the whole critical theory, queer theory is part of this whole critical theory idea.
Yeah, you could say so, and it's a lot about identity, it's a lot about like personal relations, it's a lot about power and Foucault. And
so how could you use queerness to defend your diploma?
That's
in what specific way would you do that?
Okay, so
did you do that?
This is a longer argument, but I'll try to make it short. Okay, so queerness, it manifests in a lot of different ways, in manners of speaking, in manners of dressing. You have, if I say lesbian, you get an image of your head, and that attains to a couple of different traits, often visual, and you can find them in all sorts of expressions of culture. The queerness is present, and there's an idea of what it looks like. So my assumption was that if queerness exists in all these other, in music, in clothing, in interiors, then we can identify it in architecture as well, and perhaps we can even use it. So I took a half ruin in Tbilisi, and I designed an imaginative reconstruction for it, an imaginative restoration perhaps, using these elements of queerness. And queerness in architecture, there's been a couple of books written about it, one by Anne Bratsky and one by Katerina Bonnevier. Bonnevier uses an argument that sort of lays the foundation for this whole idea, which says that queer people are used to having to pass. Either often you have to pass as straight, or else you might be in danger if you're in a lonely street at night and someone spots you as being gay or trans or whatever. So passing is very important. Or just like walking through a schoolyard when you're 15 years old and you don't want people to shout homo after you all the time. And so perhaps you adapt. Perhaps you lower your voice. You sound more manly. You make sure your wrists aren't too slippery, right? You never wear pink. Or you do all these things and you don't care about it. But whether you do it or not, there is an element of enactment. You are very conscious. You are instilled with self-consciousness. Whether you choose to abide by these rules or you choose to break with them, you're very conscious of it. And that whole idea can be used also when it comes to architecture. We can express ourselves and we can create environments for ourselves that feel safe, that feel meaningful to us, and that also function as expressions of ourselves. And one way to do that is to use references, perhaps even fiction, perhaps literature, perhaps the ideas of creating our own little worlds where we're more safe. And very often you will borrow from history to make that happen. Like I'm dressed right now. It's not that this isn't me. I feel like me in these clothes, but they also reference very obvious sources and inspirations, right? There's something academic about tweed. I don't know why, but there is. And that doubleness is a tool that can be used. And it also is an argument, especially in these times where identity is so important. It's an argument that can be used in an exam situation where you can't properly lose. Even if you're doing a Doric column, which would normally have you fail your diploma project.
And that's exactly what you did. I mean, you didn't fail, but you used the Doric column in your
Should
diploma.
I show it
yes,
now? I have
please.
it here. Yeah, okay. So this is one of the ways I interpreted the idea of queerness in architecture.
Yeah.
You have the Doric column, right? And most people who know a little bit of art history will know that it's considered to be a very male form of column.
Right. Okay. Very solid and
very solid, very simple. Very. I mean, it's a shaft. It looks.
Very
straight, very shaft-like. Let's not go there, but you know what I'm talking about. And then this building, of course, also used to be an officer's hotel. So it was a very masculine place in a way. So I'm taking that idea and I'm exaggerating it, almost the way a drag queen will like exaggerate female traits with like.
So it's in some way you're sort of playing a bit on a camp idea also.
Yeah, but the difference between this and like pure camp is that I actually followed all the rules. So
right, so
it's actually correct classicism, right? It's with the correct proportions and everything. And then, of course, the difference between this and like a normal classical facade is that this is just a freestanding thing on the outside of the other facade, which explains why it looks a bit peculiar, but half covers windows. And it's
because there's not pilasters there; they are in front.
No, they're literal, like 1.5 meter diameter white stone columns, and that's another reason why it doesn't have any color, because it's supposed to look like very like a bleak masculinity.
Okay.
Because the color is fun and inclusive, whereas this is and of course color has been associated with the feminine, right? Yeah. So this is a sort of a parody of super serious anti-feminine, anti-ornament almost architecture. But then it has a doubleness, right? Because it's also having a bit of fun. Because it's exaggerating, because it's including this, the pomegranate right on top, and it does several things at once. So it's both beautiful, it's both a real classical piece of architecture, but it also goes into that queer sensibility and speaks about things being non-essentialist, that you're allowed to clad buildings, you're allowed to clad people even. Yeah.
No, but this is also a nice way to go into this idea of how classical culture, architecture, why it appeals to us. Yeah. This idea of what exactly is it in this that relates to nature somehow.
Yeah. So I can show a bit here. I think. One of the key words there would be proportions, right? Yeah. A lot of people will associate the classical column with the human body, and this again, of course, being a Greek Doric, it doesn't have a base, but normally a column has a base, which is more or less equivalent to the feet, and then the capital is equivalent to the head. But you could also compare it to...
That's amazing that you have a human being carrying that whole weight. That's,
and
that's
I mean,
grand.
If you go to the Erechtheion on Acropolis, you have literal like statues of women carrying things, right? And also like late 19th, early 20th century architecture, you have a lot of like women and men carrying things. Carrying bay windows or some sort of plinth or all those sort of motifs. So that's a very literal way, right, of being anthropomorphic. Yeah. But anthropomorphism and biophilia can be expressed in more abstract ways, which of course this does, because this doesn't look like someone's head, but it still does a job of finishing the building towards the sky in a way that's stimulating, in a way that's, I think, to our bodies is something you recognize. It's something that's reassuring, and it has details, right? These little figurative pieces of ornament which you can actually recognize as flowers. So you combine that strength and that seriousness, I guess, in all these straight lines with these little details, and you get complexity, you get organized complexity, right? From that combination. That's the power of classical architecture to me, and that you of course can find in all these different traditions for all over the world. And I think biophilia is an interesting word to introduce here. Biophilia does not connect to queerness, even though it sounds like it. But it describes the tendency that people have towards thriving in the presence of nature. There's a classical study where you have a hospital corridor with rooms on each side. The rooms on one side are turned towards a forest, trees and some meadows and stuff. And the rooms on the other side are turned towards a blank wall. And the patients they're the same group of patients, they're giving the same treatment. But the patients who can view nature from their hospital beds, they get better soon.
Oh, yeah.
There's less evil microbes in their blood. There's rehabilitation that can't really be ascribed to anything but their view of nature and their love of nature. So I think these things are implanted in us. Some people will talk about the soul. I think we can talk about our bodies and how our bodies are in a way very primitive. We of course have modern intellectual brains, but our bodies are hairless monkeys. Let's go there. With Joseph Campbell, right, who speaks about things that communicate across time and across place. Exactly. And in short, I believe architecture can do the same thing as nature, and there's a lot of research that supports it.
So in what specific ways, if you start with the actual building, some examples,
let's point a bit.
How does it actually relate to nature?
Yeah, so one of the things that is very let's say, it gives you a lot of trust, it gives you good feelings, is having your back protected and a view across a room or a plane or something, which of course goes back to prehistoric times when people would live in caves or at least like reside outdoors, and you could see enemies coming from a distance. And if you had a cliff behind you, you knew they weren't coming from there. So these things are ingrained with us, I think. And then things, and nature in itself, trees. I like to compare classical architecture to trees. You have a fundament, almost like the roots of a tree trunk that bulge out. You can see how they're connected to the earth, how they're something solid, right? You have the either the walls or the pilasters, the columns, straight like the tree trunk. You can see how they are carrying something, and they're carrying it convincingly. You can believe they're carrying something. And then in the end, the finish towards the sky is not just a straight line, which is very abstract, but it's often softened. It could be a pediment, it could be a cupola of some kind, a dome. The
sort of continues some upward strive? Or?
And it makes, in a more metaphysical way, it points towards the heavens, the sky, and you can feel like you're something more than just a hairless monkey. But it's also on a very primal level, very assuring. The complex horizon that a building creates when it has pediments, when it has these details. I think it reminds us of trees, of nature, of things that we recognize. Then you, of course, also have the face metaphor, that buildings that look more like faces, not literally, they don't need to have like round windows and a nose-shaped opening in the middle.
Well, you mean like there's something following the same kind of proportions of distance between these different parts of the building that somehow resemble a face.
Yeah, a researcher like Anne Sussman has done research into that and have found tracking people's eyes, very modern technology. They track these extremely fast movements that the eyes make. And she's found that the facades that can be read with these elements compared to, let's say, a flat facade with very little detailing like a glass facade or something, these facades that somehow remind you of a face, they're just so much more reassuring. They just make people feel more comfortable. So, of course, like the modernist solution to this problem is that you create buildings out in nature with enormous glass walls, which can be very beautiful. And then some would argue you don't need figurative ornament or detailing inside as much if you can watch nature all the time. But then most people can't live like that, especially in this century. We're trying to save the planet. We're trying to build using less land. We're trying to minimize transports, building cities in a way that accommodates walking instead of driving everywhere. Then everyone can't live in like a square mile of nature.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So
because we're building densely.
So how do you bring nature into the building then?
Exactly, yeah. Exactly, that's what you have to do. You have to create buildings that have some of the same qualities as nature
and that's
does.
the purpose of ornamentation, for example, or...
I would argue that.
Yeah.
That all, and even hierarchy. As a social democrat, perhaps I shouldn't love hierarchy. Some people would say that...
well, I saw that panel debate that you were on. It was quite funny what you said about this. It's quite famous in Norway. This 70s building for the government. No,
yeah,
for
the old government quarters.
Yeah.
The main building there,
which is quite flat and
it's extremely flat. And it looks like an Excel sheet, right?
Yeah.
And in one way, you could argue that you can't see where the prime minister's office is. It's all very square. There's a lot of sameness. There's a lot of like equality. But I find that to be a tad too literal. You can't just say that ideology and aesthetics is the same thing. At least it doesn't. The evidence lacks, right?
So it doesn't relate to us as human beings.
No.
But then, in what sense? I mean, to stay in the specifics, how can a building like, I don't know, this temple, or if you want to use one of those examples here in some way, how can you say that it relates to a human being, human figures, literally?
No, but like let's take the classical column, for example. This is a variation because it's in Guatemala. They replaced the title ornament with corn.
Oh yeah. Right.
Because they're trying to adapt to local culture. But this is still a very good example of the capital, the top of the column, more or less equating a head. In the proportions, then with the shaft as the body and the feet as the base. It's not literal. It doesn't have to be literal. It has to be similar, and that's enough for our bodies to think of this as something familiar. And of course, these are mostly examples of classical architecture. I have a Gothic church here. I love this painting, by the way, The Architect's Dream.
Thomas Cole, I guess I forgot to say that.
Because it also shows that we have all these different impulses and they're all very valuable, even with like Egyptian, African architecture in the background, and also the Doric column, for example, like in my drawing, is probably of Nubian origin. So that's also African. And then you go to places like high classical architecture in India, the Taj Mahal, or the Forbidden City in Beijing, the Maya pyramids in South America.
Yeah.
There's these impulses all over the world to create architecture that embody these same qualities.
And that's why I wanted I'm so happy you mentioned that, because I really wanted to get that out there, that this is not something that is only Western or belongs to one political side or whatever. It is a question of that architecture has to somehow emulate or mirror us in the literal sense.
I believe so.
So you, when you're talking about, for example, also classical Japanese architecture,
absolutely,
you're saying that the same emulation of natural forms and of the human body occurs in those traditions as well?
Yes, Japanese architecture is an interesting example because it's inspired a lot of modernist architecture. It's quite simple, a lot of it. And then, of course, what the Japanese do in their traditional buildings those elements that aren't copied toward when you make something similar in Europe, is that they have these like huge bulging roofs, right? Either they cover it with rice straw, or they cover it with clay tiles that have these wonderful slopes, these curves. But Japanese architecture absolutely has these things, and it's a lot about the proportions again. Japanese architecture, traditional architecture even has these very fixed proportions based on tatami mats, and the tatami mats again are very much similar to the human body in proportion. So you'll find a lot of these same qualities. And of course, in the building materials, Japanese have traditionally built a lot from wood, a lot from earth, actually, earth plaster, and then, of course, also lime plaster and straw and these things that are recognizable to us and that stimulate us. I think this is where I should slip in another name. There's a lot of references. Perhaps we should write a
just
list
go
later.
Wild,
but Palasma, a Finnish architect, wrote a book that's called The Eyes of the Skin, where he talks about how modern architecture mostly stimulates the eye. It's not nice to touch usually, because we're using all these very these materials that are very smooth and even slippery, and they don't stimulate us. And a lot of artificial materials. Only 100 years ago, we'd use approximately 20 materials. Now we use more than 200 just to build a normal building. So that's another factor in, let's say, traditional Japanese architecture that you can also get a lot of biophilia out of. Yeah.
But do you also there find? Yeah, I don't know if is Vitruvius someone to talk about here? This idea well, I guess you already mentioned it's basically this idea that the building reflects the exact proportion somehow of the human body. Do you find that also then specifically in Japanese architecture, that it specifically relates to the human being and not only general forms in nature?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah? I think you find it in all human architecture.
Right.
And especially traditional architecture from all over the world. Modernist architecture has a lot to do with abstraction. It's very intellectual, right? And it has a lot to do with these other feelings that aren't just reassuring. And of course, other feelings other than being reassured are valuable. That's very true. But you know, there are architects who say that we don't deserve beautiful buildings today. The world is too complicated. It's not nice enough. We can't build beautiful buildings because we don't live in a beautiful world. And my reply to that would be that I think the world is hard enough as it is. We don't need to make it harder on people by making buildings that are wearing us down. We can make nice buildings, and then people can be challenged in other ways. I think there's more than enough ways to be challenged.
There's another thing though, and I don't know if that relates specifically to human proportions or proportions of nature. For example, in this building here, this idea about, now correct me if I'm wrong, it's like a general quote-unquote classical principle to have a solid sort of more heavy or larger forms in the bottom, and then, for example, windows, not necessarily in a strict manner, but sort of gradually get smaller.
Yeah, that's very common.
What's the point of that? How does that relate to us?
Well, I think it's similar to the tree. It's with its heavier bottom, the straight middle, and the finely detailed top. You can see it here, right? So the ground floor, this is Ben Pentreath in Truro in England, and it's called the Royal Crescent. And one of the reasons why I suggest we should include this picture is because it shows that classical architecture doesn't have to be this thing for the upper class. This is just like normal housing for normal people. Some of them are complete townhouses, but quite a lot of them are apartments. Anyway, so it shows that whole thing of like the heaviness in the bottom. You see there's a round arch there, the round arch, of course, like carrying a lot of load. Then there's a straight part in the middle and then an attic in the top. And the top floor as well of windows, you see they're one pane shorter than the other ones.
Exactly.
So you have that hierarchy. And going back to, I think I should finish that point of social democracy in architecture.
Yeah.
I believe that the architecture that's good for the people, like what we want in social democracy or socialism, is the architecture that is kind, it's friendly, it's inviting, it speaks the language of biophilia. And that's more important than just taking an ideological position, transferring it to a diagram and then making a facade based on that. Yeah,
that's a strange thing when you start putting ideology first, because you know, it's like Trump had this executive order on federal building.
Yeah.
And now that they're hoping that this will continue. There's an interview in Civilization magazine coming soon with a man who was mostly responsible for writing it, and he says that I hope that we can agree that this is not a partisan thing. It's about what human beings like.
Yeah, I mean that was very controversial, even among classicists in America, because.
No, it's like politics aside, the argument, it's the same thing that you're saying.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is. And I should mention that also one of the reasons why I like this picture is because it speaks a lot about pluralism, plurality, diversity, which is one of the main points also of queerness in architecture, is that you can include all these different impulses and you can appreciate that there are different people who like different things, and it can still all speak to us on a very fundamental level. So yeah, that presidential order, I'm a bit like hesitant towards it, but I think that it's no worse than the last one that it replaced, which of course said that everything has to be modernist.
I'd
like to find like a middle road where we can like different kinds of architecture. We can build all kinds of architecture.
Yeah, well, but that's a strange thing though, that then suddenly there is one person that comes in with an alternative, one little sort of opening for classical architecture, and that is seen as intolerant or whatever, and then the whole 99.9% of the rest is only, if you want to call it modernist or whatever. But it's like, I'm not so concerned with who presents it. It is the idea that this is something human beings like, and that is, I think that when you can get there, that we can agree on that, then it's not an ideological idea, because this whole thing about that you cannot make it today, that's pure ideology. I mean, it is physically impossible for me to lift this building that we're sitting in, but it is physically possible for you to draw a drawing of such a building and have it built. So if we choose not to do it, then we choose not to do it.
I agree.
Yeah. So then we're saying, okay, well, we know it's physically possible. The artisans are there. They can do it, and so it's a choice to do it or choice to not do it.
I have to pick up this then, because it says architecture, choice or fate. I think it's a very good title.
Right, and this is Leon Krier.
Yeah. So this book was quite old. It was made before he built a lot of projects. There's more stuff of him built now. This too is done. He's not the architect behind this building, but he is the architect behind the master plan, which was also done in collaboration with some local architects in Guatemala. Then an American architect, I can't quite remember his name, but he also designed that building. But that was also, again, somehow based on Leon Krier's plans. But yeah, so Krier is very concerned with that we don't view architecture as something that's thrust upon us, but that it's a field where we can actually create something. Back to the architect's dream, right? Look at him resting on top of that column. He's having the time of his life, and he's looking out on all these opportunities, right? And that's the way I interpret it. He's saying, all these things are possible.
Exactly. And that comes back to, I mean, I can understand maybe one of the easiest things to understand when it comes to how, well, should we say classical architecture, use that term, how it relates to us is the ornaments. There's natural forms somehow, that's quite apparent. But this example here doesn't really have ornaments in that sense, but it relates to the general proportions. Yeah. So it can be sort of quite sober or whatever you want to say, but still be extremely appealing. So it's not that classical architecture is one thing.
No, not at all. And then there is like a bit of history. If you look really closely on this project, every door has this like wonderful cast iron element with a little light on top of every entrance. And that has like a little bit of figurative ornament. So it doesn't have to be a lot. And as you said, like the proportions are the main thing, and perhaps also that you see, like it's a crescent, right? It's sort of embracing you. It's this welcoming concavity.
Oh,
and then you have that tiny bit of detailing, and then you have all you need to have a building that speaks to you, not just intellectually but also emotionally and perhaps biologically.
This is a perfect segue. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
That was very well done. We'll have to pay you, I think. Oh my God! So you must have been thinking what I was holding here. This is a book on Quinlan Terry, an amazing architect, and it struck me because we were talking about architecture, looking through these books yesterday, and this thing about how sensual architecture can be. And I was just thinking about it because we were looking at another architect before, and that's also an interesting issue, who sort of has more flat facades. In some way you could say takes more the sort of contemporary demands into consideration, whereas this is much more Baroque, much more sensual in that term. And then when we looked at Quinlan Terry then afterwards, I was just baffled by this one, because all of this ins and outs,
quite wonderful,
is almost like, well, we don't have to describe it too much in detail, but the ins and outs of a human body.
Oh, absolutely.
And that a building can be sensual is, wow, that's an amazing thing. But
absolutely.
Okay, why is this good?
So it's good on several levels. Let's start with the body. So I feel somehow related to this. I feel like this building is saying something that's similar to myself. You see how it bulges in the middle of the pediment, the gable on top, and then concavity. So it's like this, right? Concave, convex, concave. It's sort of embracing you, and those soft lines are speaking a very natural language, which of course also is reflected in the capitals. The Corinthian capital has a lot of these swirls and bulges and stuff, and then he takes those elements and he transfers them to like a larger scale. But at a simpler level, it's a wonderful example of a perfect example, really, of organized complexity. Organized complexity.
That is grand.
Yes, we love that. I
philosophical, I have to say. Yeah.
No, but it's taken an Italian mountain village, right? Every house is different. Not two houses are identical, but they all fit together because they're all made from the same local sandstone, let's say. And this building does the same thing. So even though there's quite a lot of variation, the side wings are very simple, very flat, very geometric. And then the middle is super bulgy and sensual and has a lot of like historical references, and it's very heavy in a way. It still fits very well together because it's all made from one material. So it's a wonderful exercise in organized complexity, in something that's varied, but still held together. And in this case, it's held together very much by the use of material, and a few other elements like the windows are also repeated. So those things I love about it as well. Then the final thing that I really like about it, and then that also goes back to the idea of queerness in architecture, which is that history is allowed in. All the references, all the positive things you think about when you see a pediment that's flowing and having fun. It reminds you of theatricality, of going to the theatre, it reminds you of the book that you read first year of art history that you had, where you learned about false perspectives. So it includes all those things that you can somehow recognize.
It's kind of referencing Borromini here.
Yes, absolutely. And he takes the Corinthianness of it, right? And he emphasizes it. So the house is just called Corinthian Villa, and I find it very convincing as an exercise in expressing this love of history that Quinlan Terry shows in so many of his projects. And I think that architecture today can also accommodate, right?
Yeah. Then there's the idea of how a building can make you feel more elevated. That's a strange thing. I thought that when I had Vegard Martinsen on, speaking of reference, we went into architecture a bit, referencing Ayn Rand. And I think that was an example, because I disagree with him, and that was an example of sort of ideas first, where coming into cathedral, according to him, made you feel small. But you know, the office building makes you feel grand because you're bigger according to the height of the room. And
theoretically, yes.
But that was so strange to me, because I mean, what I feel is that you come in and it opens up and it's grand and you're part of this and you're growing along with it. I mean, that's why you love to see Braveheart, where Mel Gibson is fighting against these people. Yes, I'm going to go out and I'm ready to fight.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that part of it, that's more of the sort of metaphysical or ethical or whatever level, where these buildings, because they reference us and sort of copy us somehow, copies nature, but also pulls us up. But that you have that mental health issue.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a very interesting example. I've of course read the book, The Fountainhead. Every architect has, more or less, and I don't find Ayn Rand's ideology very fascinating, but I like the book, and it has some good points, of course it does, but I think like Bork wrote an article that more or less gave like a Freudian explanation, like talking about her past, escaping from a communist regime, and where in this time Stalinist classicism was like was the ultimate architecture at that point that book was being written. Of course, she has to somehow distance herself from that, but it doesn't make sense in a way, because her ideology talks so much about the individual and sort of following your impulses and appreciating what is special about you.
Yeah, and I think that is a major. Yeah,
and then the architecture he argues for is so bland and it's so erasing of the individual.
Yeah, I think that's because I think then you're talking about that it's a symbol for the capitalist society. That ideologically speaking, that's sort of the quality of it for her. And I disagree with that. I don't understand that point. But I'm thinking, you know, this is going back to Campbell again, how you need to see yourself externalized, and that is, you can say, well, those are just emotions, but that's an essential part of being a human being. So you have to, and you know, the whole idea of speaking of timelessness, and this idea that what you're saying now, what I'm hearing here is that. Because it relates to nature, because it relates to the human body, that's why it's good, not because it's classical or 17th century or whatever. We've sort of been tricked. I know maybe that concept classical tricks us into believing that that's the quality, not the reference to nature. Because Campbell talks about it all the time, that you if you do not see your life somehow externalized, in worst case scenario, you can cut off from society. You can be schizophrenic, for example. He talks about in one of his lectures.
Campbell's a wonderful example, because he also, of course, references myths from all over the world, from all kinds of different times, and even dreams. And in that, he gives a perfect example of how these things are. I think they're universal, to use that word. And the universal is a controversial term these days.
You sure you want us to publish this now?
Right. Well, I do have...
You have to think about your future.
Yeah, well, I do have my environmentalist, queer activist membership card.
You have this shield. Yeah. It's like some Harry Potter shield in front of you. Okay.
So and plus these things that we're talking about, I don't find them to be ideological. I find that the science behind it is incontrovertible. You have to believe, if you believe in science, if you believe, let's say, in climate change, you can't not believe in these things, because it's quite obvious, and there's a lot of research coming out every year showing these same tendencies. And of course, they're not very popular at architecture schools these days, environmental psychology and architecture psychology, because the conclusions are very traditional, right?
Oh, right,
So it was super popular, like around the last turn of the century, like around the 2000. It was super popular in architecture schools. But then they discovered that all the conclusions were quite traditional. So now it's not very popular anymore, and there'll probably be like a back and forth going even forward. But I think that you can find a lot of these things, and I think you can find them all over the world. And even though architecture should also stimulate us intellectually, I think that classicism, for example, classicism is my example. I grew up in Norway, in Europe, and I with a love of history. Then classicism makes a lot of sense. Because it's this force in Western societies, right? It's come back again and again, and it's disappeared and come back and disappeared and come back again and again. So that makes a lot of sense for me to pursue. But I also love architecture from other civilizations all over the world, and I think they have so much to offer us, even directly inspired. I remember someone suggested that, for example, immigrant groups in Norway should be able to build houses in the style of their home country, and I can't imagine anything more wonderful than, let's say, that Oslo had like a Persian neighborhood with all kinds of like Persian houses. That would be like so wonderful, or like a Polish village or like these little thatched thingies with gables.
Well, that was funny. I was in Syria in 2013, was it? No, 2003. And I forget the village, but that was buildings for like apartment buildings, and they were quite simple, but obviously very classical, quote unquote Western, you would say if you saw it in another country, but it was in Syria.
And then, of course Syria also has the connection to classicism via Palmyra and that whole history of being like on the outer edges of the Roman Empire. And I love those mixes. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to include the Guatemalan project as well. It's called Paseo Cayala, and you don't have to be very imaginative to see an Aztec pyramid in these stairs, right?
I had my suspicions.
Yeah, and I think it's a wonderful reference. And even classical architecture, some view classical architecture as this project of purity, which I really don't. I don't think it's an exercise in purity at all. I think it's really an exercise in diversity and in inclusion. In the very word Ionic column, for example, the Ionics, they were a tribe living in the outer parts of ancient Greece, and it was their customs that were integrated into this architecture and then made into presumably something eternal. But it's mostly eternal, I think, because it adheres to these same rules that traditional architecture does all over the world. Again, going back to Tbilisi, of course, it's on the Silk Road. It's almost midway, I think, between like the East and Venice. So you have these impulses where all the houses look like Italian townhouses, except they have Arabian balconies. And then on top of some of the Arabian balconies, you have like these Swiss glass balconies as well. Okay. So there's like these glazed details, and you have these camel hotels, right? So the ground floor of the building will be like 5 meters tall, but because it has to accommodate the camels. And then you have hotel rooms for the people who are riding the caravans on top of that, and the whole language of it is quite European. But it's a camel hotel. It's a classical camel hotel. How wonderful is that? How wonderful is that meeting between these different impulses? And I find it so interesting that it can all be accommodated, right? It still makes sense.
You're a man of perfect segues. Why don't you name drop a couple of examples from all over the world? Okay. And you are also, of course, very well acquainted with New Traditional Architecture, that group on Facebook. And what strikes me is that there's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of perfect and very optimistic examples about newly made classical buildings going on. I think I mean like from Germany, or suddenly there's some church from Romania or whatever. It's all over the world, but we don't really get to hear about it.
I know, and I think spreading the word that these things are possible is is very important because it can convince new generations that they don't have to limit themselves, that they can be inclusive, they can include their local culture, they can include their love of history in the way they practice architecture.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's a number of beautiful classical buildings being built all over the world. Let's start with that wonderful villa in Palestine that is almost an exact copy of an Italian Renaissance villa, a Palladio villa.
Really?
And it looks so good. I think it's the richest man in Palestine who lives there. And it's built so solidly and so convincingly. And it shows so much civic pride in a way. Of course, Palestine is a very controversial and difficult area to live in. People's lives there are difficult. But I think everyone who sees that building sees the success of one of their own. And the marriage between European impulses and their own culture. But
that's fascinating then that a building can give society optimism.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's very fascinating, and then you can find wonderful classical buildings like private houses being built in Britain and the United States. You have Cayala in Guatemala, as I mentioned. In the very east as well, I know a very good villa in Hong Kong, built up in the hills there. Also done in a very correct but nice classicism. It has this warmth to it. But the even more interesting examples, I would say, are the examples that can be viewed as an example of fighting against entropy, right? The sameness, the fight against sameness. That's one of the most wonderful things that my teachers emphasized when I lived in Denmark. They said, don't design a building that could go anywhere. Design a building for this place, for this time, for this situation, for these people. Be specific, don't be general, because that's one of the ways you can sort of resist the sameness that's happening all over the world. Things are becoming more and more similar. And I think architects can have an instrumental role in that. So you have buildings in Denmark, for example, in Åbenrå and Svendborg, that they look so Danish. they have all these elements that make you recognize them as being Danish. Or I lived a semester in Kenya, in East Africa, and there's a whole renaissance of Swahili architecture going on there now. Swahili architecture is a lot about the courtyard. So the courtyard is sort of the heart of the house. But then you have these different elements sort of stacked around it. It's quite picturesque. And very airy. So you have this combination of these very airy things on top, almost like tents, and then heavy masonry. And that whole architecture and that whole language is having such a revival right now. And you find these things so many places in the world that people are finding pride in their own local traditions and in their own local characteristics, let's say. And of course it helps using local materials. That's also a wonderful trend that's also happening in modernist architecture, by the way, and it's a great starting point. But I think that emphasizing place instead of time, let's say, when you're designing is an interesting key. So you shouldn't be very conscious of this building has to look like it was designed in 2021. You should think this building should look like it was designed in Stavern outside of Larvik in Norway.
Well, that was so. I remember learning that when I went to together with a friend of mine. We went to Landshut outside of Munich. It was the capital of in that area, and we went to the castle there. And there's was a chapel, medieval chapel in the castle. And then she points out to me, they have this medieval sculpture standing there. And she, look at that one. Do you see anything special about it? And I was looking at it and looking at the others, and no. Well, that was commissioned by Ludwig II, the Kitsch king. And we also went to see his castle, these three castles there, or village castles. And it just struck me afterwards that this is all about the will to do it. But of course, you have to have the intelligence and the well, in our time, the courage, you could say, to actually say that this should be built.
Yeah, I agree, and hopefully this love of diversity that I think is characteristic of a number of tendencies in society today. I hope that tendency could be transferred to architecture as well, and that it could open up for the classical, for the traditional, for the local, and for the imaginative. I put on top of my drawing here. That's an apple, like a Georgian apple. There's no reason why you need a Georgian apple on top of your building. It's just like a lovely thing that people, when they see it, they will recognize it. A pomegranate, that's what it's called in English. There's a pomegranate, and there's no reason why there has to be a pomegranate there. But it doesn't insult anyone. On the other hand, it's quite lovely, and I think people who see it will appreciate it, and people who don't get the reference will still see there's like a nice golden orb on top of that building. And they won't mind. And
for some reason that...
So I believe in that inclusivity.
But then there's also, I was thinking, one example that I found so intriguing, and that sort of taught me a fundamental thing. You know that, what's the name of that cathedral that they rebuilt, and it was completely destroyed in the revolution in 1910s, or like late 1910s?
Which country are we in now?
Moscow. In Russia.
The holy...
for the cathedral for the soldiers or whatever.
It's like the main cathedral in Moscow. It used to be
So they rebuilt, I presume, that from the actual drawings of it, because it wasn't a new building, or they just redid it from the ground up. And what struck me is this idea that, of course, this is a sort of political term, synergy effect, that they talk about when they want to say that something is good. Because what you get there, well, you don't only get the architect, obviously it has to be built, so you get all the builders, or the guys who are building it, but then you get people who need to gild things, to do mosaics, to paint icons, and sculpture.
Woodwork, carving, all these people who have this expertise. And I that's when I really thought this is a really optimistic thing, because suddenly a young classical painter is given the commission to paint an altarpiece. Now that can happen. And I think it's so important to emphasize that this is not, this is architecture. It has nothing to do with other fields. It incorporates all those fields, and I think it can really create this renaissance that people are talking about all the time for a lot of other crafts as well. Absolutely, and it's good. It's good economy. Like, it's very stimulating, and it's not just like one bag of money going into to the lap of like this one rich guy. No, it's like spread out of so many different people.
Well, they have to get paid.
And then again, maybe people follow them on Instagram, and then someone is inspired to use them the next time they're like redoing their house. Instead of doing it the cheapest way possible, they might consider, okay, perhaps I should triple the cost of this one detail in this room, but it's being done by someone who has an expertise, who uses their hands, and then it would have a completely different quality to something that's just done mechanically. So that's a nice ambition for architecture as well, I think, is to stimulate those craftspeople, those artisans. That's a wonderful possibility for architecture, isn't it? As some people called architecture the mother arts, the mother art, because a lot of other forms of art started in relation to architecture. The paintings were used to decorate the walls in a building. Sculptures were used to mark an entrance or a skyline. And I think we can still sometimes take that responsibility.
This is back to Louis II. I'm so infatuated with him.
It's very fascinating. Very queer, isn't he?
Yes, I guess he was.
I think he was like literally gay as well.
I do think he was, but let's not talk too much about it now. No, the point is that in Neuschwanstein there was this bed, and it was, I think, do I remember correctly? It was a group of carpenters that spent I don't know, 2 or 4 years,
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
with spears and all kinds of things going on.
Yeah.
And that is just wonderful. Like, I mean, if people can see that aspect of it, that this is not just architecture; it's all those crafts that are being get pulled up along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this one decorative painter. I get like a ping every time she posts something, on Instagram, and it's just such a wonderful thing to. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning and I feel dreary, and I see her like, designing a marbled wall somewhere in rural Sweden. It makes me so happy to just see that sort of stuff going on and seeing that there are so many competent people out there.
Right. I think that's so important, and that's why I was so happy to meet you. And to hear all those things, because we have to get the message out there. There's so much positive things going on. But there's one thing, shifting a little bit, when it comes to sort of the practicalities around it. This idea of classical buildings being expensive, or like what's your thoughts on that? Like, can that be less expensive to build? I've heard someone say that you actually save money on it, or as an argument for the economy of this.
There is an issue there, definitely, because right now architecture, like everything else in our society, is mostly being made to be thrown away in 20 years or less. There's this consumerist attitude towards everything, right? You buy a new watch. Oh, it breaks. You just throw it away. Buy a new one. You buy some trousers. They break. You buy new ones. You build a house. It looks wonderful. All your friends come around and say, "Oh, this is such a wonderful house." Then it gets old. The paint starts to peel. And then you either like completely renovate it and replace half the materials in the house, or you even like said someone knocks it down and builds a new house. So there's of course a huge issue there, and I think we're in a territory we're talking about like economic models and those sort of problems, where one obvious answer would be, if someone is going to own a building and not just sell it at once, they will be more conscious of how does it age? Does it age with dignity? Does it age in a way that's practical? And then if you have those ideas in mind when you build, you'll choose solutions that are not just single-use architecture. So that's one reply, right? So if someone builds something that's built to last, I think consumers have to demand it as well. They have to ask, is this thing I'm going to buy, is it going to hold up? And the other side of it, of course, is that modern technology offers amazing improvements and alternatives. I love something that's made by hand, but I completely accept that some things aren't. This glass, I love it, but it's not something that's someone made in like the 18th century, like spending their whole week making this one glass. There's a project in Oslo where they just replaced some stone balusters, like the things holding up a handrail, and some of them were broken. I had to replace them, and I just noticed last time I passed by that they had been replaced by machine-cut balusters, and they actually looked kind of cool. First of all, they look completely identical to the other ones because they are made of the same kind of stone. And then if you look really closely, you can see like these rings where the machine has carved out the stone. And I think if the alternative had been to just order something that looked a bit similar from China or India, and they have wonderful stone, but there's something about emphasizing and appreciating what's local. So they use the same kind of stone, but then it's machine carved, and I think that's a perfectly fine compromise. So you can use a lot of modern technologies as well. Yeah,
you can easily fall into sort of a purist trap where everything should be, strictly classical and there should be no compromise at all, and then you end up not having anything built, right?
Yeah.
But can you say that that it's worth it economically to build classical? Or does that demand that you have to think, spread that money out on a much longer scale, time scale.
It can be economical, and you do see all over the world that classical buildings sell very well. Like they're very popular. A lot of people want to live in those new classical places.
So it's not really an argument.
No, I wouldn't say so. No. Then of course in Oslo these days you can build anything and it will get sold. Like there's no limit to what people will buy. But that's again an issue that has to do with the market and whether it should be regulated differently or more or less. Or I don't have the answers there. That's a huge question. But architecture, classical architecture, well-designed classical architecture, you can't just like put some like lines on the window and say this is classical, or like take a picture of a pediment and show it to your builder. You have to have people who are competent in designing these things. But if you have that and it's well done, that's definitely added value. I would say so. And one more thing I'll mention there is that, as I said, one of the points of queerness in architecture is that you have the right to be who you want to be, who you feel like you are. It's a non-essentialist view, right? So cladding or clothing, same kind of thing. Use the word cladding, right, for things that you cover facades with. And some would view that as inauthentic. But I would say that this demand for the authentic, it's quite oppressive because there's so much it doesn't allow for. It doesn't allow for buildings that are friendly, that incorporate that, at least that sort of friendliness, that references history, that references these old hierarchies that look like something that was built before, to be very literal. And I think that demand for authenticity is very it's very out of tune with the love of diversity that exists in most of society.
I mean, you have that idea from Loos, Adolf Loos.
Yeah.
What is it? Ornament als Verbrechen. Ornament is a crime.
Yeah, which some would say is like super racist because he based that on anthropological studies of tribes from all over the world, right? And he's more or less saying we shouldn't be like these primitive, vulgar people in Patagonia or whatever.
Oh, I see.
or the lower classes with their tattoos. Like, who wants to be like the lower classes? That's more or less what he's saying.
That's an aspect
it's
too.
Racist and classist. So congratulations to Adolf Loos on like ticking both of those boxes.
I think you just killed him.
I'm sorry. I mean, yeah. So there's these problems with that demand for authenticity. That they leave so little room for movement for people and so little room for inclusivity. So in that way, I don't mind either a building that's, let's say in early 19th century Norway, you had so many buildings that looked like they were made out of stone, but they were really made of wood. And they were painted in like these sand-colored stones, for example, sandstone colors. And no one's saying these days that we should tear those buildings down. Like the building where our constitution was written. That's one of the buildings that it's sort of trying to look like a masonry building.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. Speaking of this idea of truth, Karl Korsnes, whom you know as well, had a funny story where he was talking with they were talking about architecture and sitting in Rome. And of course, surrounded by classical architecture, and they were talking about how this other person was saying that it's, I guess he used the term inauthentic. If you build it today,
dishonest.
It's like you don't need the columns because you don't need the column to carry the whatever it supposedly carries, right? And then Karl Korsnes was saying, what about those the dentals? Up under the roof of the buildings, these little boxes. And suddenly pointed out that those dentals on the authentic classical buildings, the reason why they're there is that there were beams that would carry the roof.
Yeah.
But these dentals don't carry anything.
Yeah.
It's just ornament. So the authentic classical buildings are then not authentic. No. You have to purify the whole history of
nothing
architecture.
passes the test. Like even this Mies van der Rohe building, this like super modernist skyscraper in New York, where it's all about honesty, right? So he let like the steel structure, the steel columns that hold this building up. He wanted to show them, but the problem is they were being destroyed by the weather. So he had to glue new ones on the outside of the building. So that's like it's inauthentic, but it's pretending to be more authentic than something that's considered to be inauthentic. It's like this super weird game.
Oh my god, this is a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I know. so again, like you said, nothing passes a test. And I think we should appreciate that and accept that there's more to architecture than being essentialist and being hung up on authenticity, because it offers so many more opportunities when you try to do something that's inclusive.
Yeah. Perfect. Kristian Hoff-Andersen, thank you for coming to the Cave of the Palace.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. I'd also like to thank our top sponsors, Fergus Ryan, Jared Fountain, Marco Campos, Michael Masco, Stacey Evangelista, Sean Roberts, and Maurice Robbins for making the show possible. And be sure to head over to caveofpalace.com/donate and support our show. I'll see you next month.